What happens when a desperate priest's prayers are answered by the last person on earth he'd expect? In the harsh frontier town of Dustwood Creek, where faith seems as scarce as water in a drought, one Sunday morning will change everything when an Apache warrior walks through the church doors during Mass. But who is really saving whom? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and let's discover together how redemption can come from the most unexpected places. My name is Father Isaiah Blackwood, and I've never felt further from God's grace than I did that scorching July morning in Dustwood Creek, Arizona Territory. 3 weeks had passed since I'd arrived, with nothing but a worn leather satchel containing my father's Bible, 17 silver dollars, and faith that seemed to shrink like a dying campfire with each passing day. The small adobe church stood at the edge of town, like a forgotten promise, its wooden cross casting a lonely shadow across the dusty main street. When Bishop Morrison had sent me here from the comfortable parishes of St. Louis, he'd spoken of a growing frontier community hungry for spiritual guidance. What I found instead was a settlement of barely 200 hardened souls who treated me like an unwelcome stranger, carrying some contagious disease. The church itself was a testament to broken dreams. Built 10 years ago by some optimistic soul, it could seat perhaps 50 worshippers on hand-hewn wooden pews. The single stained glass window depicting Christ as the Good Shepherd had been shipped from Chicago at considerable expense. Now it cast colored light across empty benches, illuminating nothing but dust motes and my growing despair. I'd spent the morning sweeping the church steps, hoping someone might notice the effort and feel moved to attend Sunday service. The July heat was already building, promising another day of temperatures that would make the devil himself sweat. My black clerical clothes felt like a furnace in this Arizona wasteland. "Morning, Father," Sheriff Caleb Ridgway called out as he made his rounds, spurs jingling against the wooden boardwalk. The sheriff was a lean man in his 40s, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier violence. His tone carried polite indifference, the kind reserved for traveling peddlers and other temporary inconveniences. "Good morning, Sheriff," I replied, forcing a pastoral smile while wiping sweat from my brow. "Beautiful morning for worship. I don't suppose you'll be joining us." Ridgway adjusted his hat against the strengthening sun. "Afraid not, Father. Got to keep watch for Apache raiders. They've been spotted near Miller's Ranch again. Found tracks yesterday, maybe 15 warriors moving south." The Apache. Always the excuse. For 3 weeks I'd heard nothing but warnings about Apache raids, Apache attacks, Apache this and that. Fear had become this town's only religion, and I was merely an unwanted preacher of a different faith. As Ridgway continued his patrol, I watched the usual Sunday morning routine. Mayor Cornelius Blackstone emerged from his imposing 2-story house, adjusted his expensive suit jacket, and walked purposefully toward Hannigan's saloon instead of the church. Jeremiah Mills opened his general store, hanging his closed Sundays Apache Watch sign in the window. Even Doc Theodore Hartwell tipped his hat politely and continued making house calls. I rang the church bell at 9 o'clock sharp, its bronze voice echoing off empty streets and closed shutters. The sound seemed to mock me, calling faithful souls who weren't there. Inside the modest sanctuary, wooden pews sat empty except for dust motes dancing in colored light from that expensive stained glass window. At 9:15, Martha Weatherby from the boarding house shuffled in. She was perhaps 55, with iron-gray hair pinned beneath a black bonnet. She nodded curtly and took a seat in the back pew, her presence feeling more like obligation than devotion. At 9:20, old Pete Garrison hobbled in, his wooden leg tapping against the floorboards. Pete had lost his leg in an Apache raid 5 years ago. He came to church more to spite his attackers than to worship, his presence an act of defiance against the Apache who'd maimed him. 2 congregants, in a town of 200 souls. I opened my worn Bible to Psalms, trying to find words that might reach hearts hardened by frontier life and constant fear. The leather binding was cracked from years of use, first by my father in Ohio, then through seminary and my assignments in Missouri parishes where people actually wanted to hear God's word. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," I began, my voice echoing in the nearly empty space, bouncing off adobe walls that seemed to absorb hope rather than amplify it. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters." Martha Weatherby stared straight ahead with fixed attention. Pete Garrison dozed fitfully, his chin dropping before jerking awake again. This was my congregation. This was God's work in Dustwood Creek. I had launched into my sermon about finding light in darkness when the church door creaked open with a long, ominous groan. The morning sun created a silhouette that made my breath catch. Martha gasped audibly. Pete's eyes snapped wide, his hand reaching for a gun that wasn't there. An Apache warrior stood in the doorway. He was tall and powerfully built, easily 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean frame of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle across this unforgiving desert. His copper skin gleamed with sweat and dust from hard travel, marked with old scars that spoke of battles survived. Long black hair hung around his shoulders, adorned with eagle feathers and bone ornaments that caught the morning light. He wore traditional buckskin leggings, a beaded vest displaying intricate geometric patterns, and a red cloth headband. But it was his eyes that held me frozen. Dark as storm clouds, they held fierce intelligence, unshakable dignity, and something else, desperation. This wasn't the cold gaze of a predator. This was a man who'd reached the end of his rope. The warrior's gaze swept the sanctuary with methodical attention, taking in the modest altar, the wooden cross, and the three of us frozen like statues. His hand rested on the decorated handle of a knife at his belt, but he made no threatening moves. Instead, he stepped fully into the church and closed the door behind him. The soft click echoed like a gunshot. Martha's breathing came in panicked gasps. Pete sat rigid, every muscle tensed for fight or flight, his hands gripping the wooden pew until his knuckles showed white. The Apache warrior's eyes met mine across the sanctuary, and I saw something that made my heart skip. He wasn't here for violence. Despite everything I'd been told about Apache raiders, this man wasn't here to kill or terrorize. He was here for the same reason anyone came to church. He was searching for something his own world couldn't provide. But before I could speak, the sound of running footsteps echoed from outside. Shouts followed, angry voices calling warnings. Apache in the church. Someone yelled, "Get the sheriff!" Someone had seen him enter. Someone had raised the alarm. The warrior heard it too. His hand tightened on his knife handle, and those dark eyes that had held such desperate hope moments before now flickered with the dangerous look of a cornered animal. Heavy boots pounded the boardwalk. I could hear rifle actions being worked, the metallic clicks of weapons being prepared. Men were positioning themselves around the building, and their intentions were clear. The town of Dustwood Creek was about to discover that their missing priest was standing between them and what they'd see as their greatest threat. But what I was beginning to understand might actually be the answer to prayers I hadn't even known I'd been praying. Chapter 2. My heart hammered like a blacksmith's anvil as the shouts outside grew louder and more urgent. "Apache in the church!" The words carried across the dusty street with wildfire speed. "Get your guns! Surround the building!" Heavy boots thundered against wooden boardwalks as men converged on our little sanctuary. The warrior, still standing just inside the door like a statue carved from desert stone, turned toward the growing commotion. Every muscle in his powerful frame tensed like a coiled spring. His dark eyes darted between the door and the small window near the altar, calculating escape routes with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd survived by always being ready to run or fight. "Wait!" I called out, the single word cracking through the silence like a whip. My voice sounded stronger than I felt, more certain than I had any right to be. He looked at me with surprise, as if he'd forgotten there were other people in the church. For a moment, our eyes locked across the sanctuary, and I felt like I was looking into the soul of a man carrying burdens I couldn't imagine. Martha Weatherby made a small whimpering sound from the back pew, her weathered hands pressed against her mouth. Pete Garrison sat frozen, his combat instincts warring with his physical limitations. The old soldier wanted to act, but his wooden leg left him vulnerable. "Please," I continued, taking a careful step down from the pulpit, my hands visible and empty. "You came here for a reason." The Apache warrior's eyes narrowed, studying my face with intensity that made me feel completely exposed, as if he could read every secret I'd ever kept. When he spoke, his English was clear but heavily accented, each word carefully chosen. "You, priest man?" The question was simple, but I sensed layers beneath it. He wasn't just asking about my profession. He was trying to understand what kind of man I was, whether I could be trusted. "Yes. Father Isaiah Blackwood." I gestured slowly toward the wooden cross. "This is God's house. You're welcome here." A bitter laugh escaped his lips, carrying more pain than humor. "Welcome? Your people. They come with guns now." The sounds outside were getting closer and more organized. I could hear Sheriff Ridgway's voice barking orders. "Surround the church! Watch the windows! Don't let him escape!" The scrape of boots on gravel told me men were positioning themselves around the building. Through the colored glass, I caught glimpses of movement. Shadows of armed men taking positions, sunlight glinting off rifle barrels, the nervous energy of a town that had lived in fear so long it had become their default response. "What's your name?" I asked, taking another small step closer. The warrior hesitated, weighing the wisdom of revealing his identity. Finally, he lifted his chin with proud defiance. "I am Nalnish of the Chiricahua Apache." Nalnish. The name felt powerful, carrying weight and dignity that demanded respect. I tried to pronounce it correctly, showing that I took both him and his heritage seriously. "Nalnish, why did you come here?" His jaw tightened, and I thought he wouldn't answer. The sounds outside built to a crescendo. Angry voices, metallic clicks of rifles being cocked, whispered tactical discussions of men preparing for violence. "My son," he said finally, the words tearing from his throat like pieces of his heart. "My boy, he is sick, very sick." The admission seemed to cost him physically. I could see the internal struggle. Warrior's stoicism battling against a father's desperate love, pride warring with the humiliation of seeking help from enemies. "The medicine man," he continued, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He says the sickness is too strong, the spirits, they do not hear his prayers. He says—" Nalnish's voice faltered, and I saw the warrior's mask slip, revealing the terrified father beneath. "He says the boy will die before the moon is full again." Understanding crashed over me like a cold mountain stream. This fierce Apache warrior had swallowed his pride, risked his life, and walked into enemy territory because his child was dying, and he'd exhausted every option his culture could provide. Somewhere in his desperate heart, he'd wondered if the white man's God might have power where Apache medicine had failed. "How old is your son?" I asked softly. 7 winters. Nalnish's hand moved to something hanging from his neck, a small leather pouch that probably contained some token of his boy. "He burns with fever for many days, cannot eat, cannot—" His English failed him, and he gestured toward his throat, eyes reflecting helpless frustration. "Cannot breathe well?" He nodded grimly. "Each breath, it fights him, like drowning in air." Agree. The clinical part of my mind recognized the symptoms. Pneumonia, most likely, or influenza, complicated by respiratory infection. In eastern cities, doctors had treatments that might help. Out here, such illnesses claimed lives regularly. "Father Blackwood!" Sheriff Ridgway's voice boomed from outside. "We know there's an Apache in there. Are you hurt? Has he threatened you?" I looked at Nalnish, at this proud man who'd risked everything for love of his child, and felt something shift inside my chest. For 3 weeks, I'd been begging God to show me how to reach these people. Maybe this was his answer. Not in the way I'd expected, but in the way he often worked, through the broken, the desperate, the least likely. "I'm fine, Sheriff," I called back, surprised by the strength in my voice. "Give me a moment." "Like hell," came Ridgway's angry reply. "Open this door right now or we're coming in." Nalnish's hand moved to his knife, but his eyes remained on my face, watching for any sign of betrayal. I held up my hand peacefully. "There's another way," I said quietly. "Doc Hartwell, he's a good man. He has medicines that might help your son." The Apache warrior shook his head violently. "White doctor will not heal Apache child. He will turn away, let him die, or bring soldiers to our camp. Not if I ask him. Not if he understands this is about saving a child's life." "You would do this? For Apache?" The disbelief in his voice was absolute. "For a father trying to save his son," I replied, and the words came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "For a child who deserves to live regardless of what his father's people and mine have done to each other." Something profound changed in Nalnish's dark eyes, a flicker of hope, as fragile as candlelight in winter wind, but real nonetheless. It was the first time since arriving in Dustwood Creek that I'd seen anyone look at me with genuine faith. But before he could respond, the church door rattled violently as someone tested the handle. "Time's up, Father!" Ridgway shouted. "Stand back!" I looked at the door, then at Nalnish, then at the terrified faces of Martha and Pete. In that moment, I made a decision that would either save lives or destroy everything. "There's a back window behind the altar," I whispered urgently. "You can reach the creek bed. Follow it north past town limits." Nalnish stared in amazement. "You help me escape?" "I help a father get back to his dying son." I pushed open the small window. "But first, tell me where to find you when I bring the doctor." "You cannot bring White Doctor to Apache camp. He will not come." "Where, Nalnish?" The sound of splintering wood told me Ridgway was done waiting. 3 miles north," Nalnish said quickly, already moving toward the window. "Canyon with red rocks shaped like sleeping bear. Small stream, cottonwood grove. But White Doctor will not come." "What's your son's name?" "Dehia. It means starts to ascend." "Dehia," I repeated, committing it to memory. "I'll bring help, Nalnish. I promise." The Apache warrior looked at me for one long moment, and I saw something I'd never encountered in Dustwood Creek, someone who actually believed in me. Then he was gone, slipping through the window just as the door exploded inward, and Sheriff Ridgway stormed in with 6 armed men, their rifles sweeping the empty sanctuary. "Where is he?" Ridgway demanded. I stood at the altar, hands resting on my Bible, and looked the sheriff straight in the eye. "Gone to save his dying son," I said quietly, "and I'm going to help him do it." Sheriff Ridgway's face turned red as a summer sunset when my words finally sank in. "You what?" he sputtered, his rifle still trained on the empty space where Nalnish had been moments before, as if the Apache warrior might materialize through sheer disbelief. "I said I'm going to help him save his dying son." I walked calmly toward the church entrance, past the sheriff and his 6 deputies, who stood gaping like they'd witnessed water flowing uphill. The morning heat hit me like a physical blow as I stepped into the blazing Arizona sun, but I kept walking with more purpose than I'd felt in 3 weeks. "Father, you can't be serious," Doc Hartwell said from the boardwalk, where he'd arrived with the crowd drawn by the commotion. The physician's usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing genuine alarm beneath his professional calm. That was an Apache warrior. These people are savages. They kill without thinking twice. I stopped in the dusty street and turned to face the crowd that had gathered. It seemed like half the town had materialized at the first shout of "Apache," more people than I'd managed to attract in 3 weeks of dedicated ministry. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken a perceived threat rather than salvation's promise to bring them together. Mayor Blackstone stood behind the doctor, his expensive suit already wilting in the heat, his face flushed with anger, confusion, and what looked like political concern. Jeremiah Mills clutched a double-barreled shotgun like his life depended on it, knuckles white against the polished stock. Even Martha Weatherby had followed us outside, though she maintained careful distance from the armed men. "That savage," I said loud enough for everyone to hear clearly, "has a 7-year-old son named Dahia, who's dying of fever and respiratory distress. He came to God's house asking for help because his own medicine man has exhausted every treatment their culture knows." A murmur ran through the gathered townspeople, not entirely sympathetic, but not entirely hostile either. I could see uncertainty flickering across several faces, as if my words had planted seeds of doubt about their assumptions. "He came to scout our defenses," Mayor Blackstone shouted, his political instincts kicking in as he tried to control the narrative. "Father, these people have been attacking our ranches for months. They killed the Morrison family just last spring, burned them out, and left their bodies for buzzards. And we've killed plenty of them too," I replied quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. The crowd fell silent at my words, uncomfortable with having their own capacity for violence acknowledged so directly. "We've hunted them, shot them, driven them from their ancestral lands, and treated them like animals to be exterminated. But right now, there's a child dying 3 miles from here, and his father risked his life to come ask for help. That's not the action of a scout or raider. That's the action of a desperate father who loves his son more than he fears his enemies." Sheriff Ridgway lowered his rifle slightly, confusion beginning to replace anger in his weathered features. "Father, even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not convinced it is, we can't just ignore the fact that he's Apache. These people have been at war with us for decades." "Have they?" I asked, turning to face him directly. "Or have we been at war with each other? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like both sides have plenty of blood on their hands." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several men exchanged glances, and I could see my words hitting home whether they wanted to admit it or not. These were people who'd lived through Apache raids, yes, but they'd also participated in cavalry actions against Apache camps. They knew the violence wasn't one-sided, even if admitting it challenged their worldview. "Doc Hartwell," I continued, turning to face the physician directly, "you took an oath when you became a doctor, didn't you? To heal the sick and injured, to preserve life wherever possible." The doctor's grey eyebrows knitted together like storm clouds, and he adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles nervously. "Well, yes, but Father, you don't understand the complicated situation we have here. The Apache aren't just—" "Did that oath specify white patients only?" I interrupted, pressing my advantage as I saw uncertainty flickering in his intelligent eyes. Doc Hartwell's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak coherently. "No, of course not. But, Father, you don't understand the practical realities of frontier life. The Apache have been—" "The Apache what?" I felt something burning in my chest, a righteous anger that surprised me with its intensity. Don't love their children the same way we do? Don't feel the same terror when they watch their babies suffering that any parent would feel? Don't pray to whatever God they know when human medicine fails and all they have left is hope? The crowd was growing larger by the minute. I could see faces appearing in windows, people emerging from stores and houses. Mrs. Henderson from the hotel had come out onto her porch. The blacksmith had abandoned his forge, standing in his leather apron with hammer still in hand. Even some of the working girls from Hannigan's saloon had gathered, their painted faces reflecting curiosity rather than their usual practiced indifference. 3 weeks ago, I continued, my voice carrying across the dusty street like a Sunday sermon, I came to this town thinking I'd minister to faithful Christians eager to hear God's word. Instead, I found people so consumed by fear and hatred that they couldn't see past their prejudices to recognize basic human decency. That Apache warrior, Nalnish, showed more genuine faith walking into this church than any of you have demonstrated in all the time I've been here. "Now see here, Father," Mayor Blackstone began, his political instincts finally kicking in as he realized this conversation was spiraling beyond his control. "No, you see here," I cut him off, feeling the power of absolute moral certainty flowing through me like electricity. "I'm going to that canyon, and I'm taking medical supplies to help a dying child. Doc Hartwell, you can come with me and actually practice the healing arts you claim to believe in, or you can stay here and explain to your own conscience why you let a 7-year-old boy die because you were too afraid to treat someone whose skin happens to be a different color than yours. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the wind rustling through sagebrush at the town's edge, the distant sound of a horse stamping its feet in the livery stable, even the faint buzzing of flies around the water trough in front of Miller's store. Doc Hartwell stood frozen in the middle of the street, his black medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands, his face cycling through a dozen different emotions as he wrestled with competing obligations. The crowd watched us both with the fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial match, waiting to see which of us would blink first. Then, from the back of the group, an unexpected voice spoke up with the quiet authority that comes from having survived more than most people could imagine. "I'll go with you, Father." Everyone turned in surprise to see old Pete Garrison limping forward through the crowd, his wooden leg tapping against the sun-baked earth with each determined step. The man who'd lost his limb to an Apache raid, who had more reason than anyone in Dustwood Creek to hate them, was volunteering to help save an Apache child. "Pete, you can't be serious," Sheriff Ridgway said, his voice reflecting the amazement that rippled through the gathered crowd. "After what they did to you, after what some of them did to me," Pete corrected firmly, his grizzled chin jutting out with stubborn determination. "This here's a different Apache with a sick boy who needs doctoring. And the father's right. A child's a child, no matter who his daddy is or what color his skin happens to be." A murmur of approval ran through part of the crowd, though I could see several faces still reflecting skepticism and hostility. But Pete's words had clearly struck home with some townspeople, particularly those who'd known him longest and respected his frontier wisdom. Doc Hartwell looked from Pete to me, then back to the crowd, watching us with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to outright hostility. I could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features, professional duty warring with personal safety, the oath he'd taken as a young man battling against the practical realities of frontier survival. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly in what looked like defeat, though I preferred to think of it as acceptance of a higher calling. "Lord, forgive me for what I'm about to do," he muttered under his breath, then spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "If we're going to attempt this fool errand, we'd better do it right. I'll need someone to carry extra medical supplies, and if we're really going to treat a child with respiratory distress, we'll need clean water, blankets, and probably a dozen other things." A cheer went up from part of the crowd, not everyone, but enough to tell me that some hearts in Dustwood Creek weren't completely hardened by years of fear and mutual hostility. Martha Weatherby stepped forward, her stern expression softening into something that almost resembled maternal concern. "I'll pack food and water for the journey," she announced in her no-nonsense voice. "If we're going to help a sick child, we might as well do it properly." Within an hour we had assembled what felt like a small expedition. Besides myself, Doc Hartwell, Pete Garrison, and Martha Weatherby, we'd been joined by Jeremiah Mills, who'd decided that someone needed to keep an eye on us, in case this whole thing turns out to be an elaborate Apache trap. I suspected his real motivation was curiosity rather than concern, but I wasn't about to turn down additional help. Doc Hartwell had packed his medical bag with fever-reducing powders, laudanum for pain management, clean bandages, and a small bottle of whiskey for sterilization. Martha had provided jerky, hardtack, dried fruit, and 2 large canteens of fresh water. Mills had contributed a rifle and ammunition just in case, along with additional blankets that might be needed for a sick child. Sheriff Ridgway had argued against the entire enterprise for 30 minutes, but ultimately decided that if we were determined to commit this act of collective lunacy, he'd rather know exactly where we were going and when to expect us back. He'd also insisted on sending 2 deputies to shadow us at a distance, ready to provide backup if things went wrong. The ride north toward the Red Rock Canyon felt like the longest 3 miles of my life. With each step our horses took across the desert landscape, I found myself wondering if I was leading good people to their deaths, or if somehow this impossible situation might actually work out the way I'd been praying it would. The July heat was brutal, even in the early hours. Our horses kicked up small dust clouds with each step, and the sun reflected off rocks and sand with an intensity that made my eyes water despite my hat brim. Pete Garrison rode his horse with the careful balance of a man who'd learned to compensate for his disability, while Doc Hartwell kept checking and rechecking his medical supplies with nervous energy. When we finally spotted the rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, my heart began racing with anticipation and terror. Nalnish had said 3 miles north, canyon with red rocks shaped like a sleeping bear. This had to be it. There, Pete pointed with a gnarled finger toward a cluster of cottonwood trees growing near what looked like a stream bed. Smoke rising from those trees. That'll be their camp. Doc Hartwell pulled his horse up short, his face pale beneath his hat brim. Father, are you absolutely certain about this? Once we ride down into that canyon, there's no turning back. If this is a trap, if they're waiting for us. I thought about the desperate hope I'd seen in Nalnish's dark eyes, about a little boy named Dehia fighting for his life, while his father risked everything to find help, about 3 weeks of empty pews and closed hearts in Dustwood Creek. I'm certain, Doc, God didn't call me to this frontier to play it safe in a comfortable church. Maybe healing one Apache child is the key to healing all the hatred and fear that's poisoned this place for too long. We rode down into the canyon together, 5 unlikely pilgrims carrying medicine and hope toward an encounter that would either prove my faith justified or destroy us all. But as we approached the Apache camp, I saw Nalnish emerge from behind the cottonwood trees, and the expression on his weathered face told me that little Dehia was still alive. There was still time. There was still hope. And sometimes I was learning that's all God needs to work a miracle that changes everything. What did you think of Father Isaiah's incredible leap of faith? Could you have made the same choice in his position? This story shows us that courage and compassion can bridge even the deepest divides. Let us know in the comments below what you thought of this tale of redemption and unexpected friendship on the frontier. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories from the Old West, and tell us what kind of Western adventure you'd like to see next.